Okay, but this Christian business is getting harder and harder all the time now. Now you can't even go out to dinner or lunch with somebody, if you know who they are and you're enjoying it. What a mean religion. Well, I mean, if you take it seriously, I mean, it really does say, do this. Well, here's how the two readings, the first reading and the gospel, really fit in pretty well today. The first reading talks about, my friend, conduct your affairs with humility, which means you put other people before you, and you will be revered more than a giver of good gifts. And that, from one of the books in the Old Testament that have to do with wisdom, that is really true, isn't it? Really, really, very true. Conduct your affairs with humility. In other words, put yourself last and other people first. And that's awfully hard to do because most of us don't tend to come by that naturally. I mean, there used to be a book out called Winning Through Intimidation, and taking care of number one. Because we're number one, right? And so I think it's kind of ingrained in us, to see ourselves as being self-righteous and putting ourselves in an important place because obviously you do have to love yourself. But a humble person really does see other people as being in the same world, having the same needs, and be entitled to the same things that we all seek. So we had a priest once who, he had a favorite saying. When someone would come up to him, he would say, quite sincerely and in a mild tone, he'd say, "Hello, how can I help you today?" I tell you the truth, I've never run into anybody else who actually used that same greeting, but it was so endearing, "Hello, how can I help you today?" And he wasn't a salesperson. I mean, you probably hear that in the store, "Hi, can I help you?" And of course, what's the answer? "Just looking, thank you." Just looking, thank you. It seems like when you're in a store, by the way, either everyone is coming up and saying, "Can I help you? Have you made a decision yet?" No, fine, not going to buy anything. But then when you do see something, you're going like, I've almost had to stand on like where the mannequins are raised up in order to try to see where the cash register sign is, because they're limited now. You only have like one or two of those. All right, that was not a prime point for my sermon, but I couldn't help telling you about it. So, we have a great deal of self-interest. And so what happens here, now you have this just built into us. So now Jesus is at a wealthy dinner. It's on a Sabbath. It's at the town's leading Pharisee. And everybody wants to watch and see what's Jesus going to do, what's he going to say. This was teachable moments that Jesus took advantage of, and he does the same thing here. When he says, when you're invited to a wedding, because you notice how the people were taking the higher places. I want us to get close to. I want to sit near the front of the table. He says, no, put yourself last. Put yourself last. Now, what essentially is happening here is that the first reading and the gospel are talking about how we position ourselves with regard to others. But Jesus adds a moment to that where he says, what about the poor? If you happen to be wealthy, how do you position yourself, not just with regard to your wealthy friends, but who could repay you at any time, but what about the ones who have no wealth? Do they even enter into our thinking? And I was looking at another wisdom book and from Sirach, and it says this, and it had to do with how people use their wealth. It's chapter 14, the use of wealth. Now, this has to do with somebody whose wealth does them no good. And you understand as we get into it. It says, wealth ill becomes the mean man. I don't mean aggressive. It means stingy, mean, tight, cheap. With wealth ill becomes the mean man, and to the miser, of what use is gold? What he denies himself, he collects for others. In his possessions, a stranger one day will revel after he dies. To whom will he be generous? Who is stingy with himself and does not enjoy what is his own? None is more stingy than he who is stingy with himself. He punishes his own miserliness. If ever he is generous, it is by mistake, and in the end, he displays his greed. In the miser's opinion, his share is too small. He refuses his neighbor and brings ruin on himself. The miser's eye is rapacious for bread, but on his own table he sets it stale because it's cheap. And then it says this, my son, use freely whatever you have and enjoy it as best you can. Remember that death does not tarry, nor have you been told the grave's appointed time. Before you die, be good to your friend. Give him a share in what you possess. Deprive not yourself of present good things. Let no choice portion escape you. Will you not leave your riches to others and your earnings to be divided by lot? So give, take, and treat yourself well, for in the netherworld there are no joys to seek. Remember, my son, all flesh grows old, like a garment. The age-old law is all must die. As with the leaves that grow on a vigorous tree, one falls off and another sprouts, so with the generations of flesh and blood, one dies and another is born. All your work will perish and decay, and your handiwork will follow after you are dead. So here's where it's saying, in a sense, hey, if you got it, spend it. Have some parties with your friends. Go out to dinner. Let's have a feast. Of course, the Sabbath was a religious feast. Now here, Jesus is saying, don't invite your friends because they might repay you. Invite the poor because they're the most needy. So this is the difference between the Old Testament use of wealth and New Testament use of wealth. Old Testament use of wealth was, essentially eat, drink, and be merry because, tomorrow we die. And what Jesus is saying is, yes, tomorrow we all will die, but what about the people that are dying in front of us right now? Who thinks of them? The Lord makes a home for the poor, but that psalm response has to do with the kingdom of heaven. Who makes a home for the poor now? We often don't think of the least while we ourselves are enjoying ourselves. And it's not a crime, it's not a sin to, be with your friends. But Jesus brings a deeper dimension, which is what the kingdom of heaven is supposed to bring. He talks about a dimension of not just using your treasure wisely for your own enjoyment, but of justice, the issue of justice, the issue of compassion, the issue of righteousness. He says, so, you'll be repaid in life of the world to come. There was another time where he told a person who was rich, when he said, what must I do to inherit eternal life? And he said, good teacher. And he says, why call me good? He says, you have the commandments, you know them. And he says, I've kept all of these since my youth. He says, and then he says, well, go and live. Because he said, the commandments are love God, love your neighbor. Jesus says, you have answered correctly. Do this and you shall live. Because he said, how do you read the law? What is it that God asks of us? How do you interpret it? And then you know that story well, where the young man, because he wanted to justify himself, said, but who is my neighbor? And then Jesus told the story about a poor guy who had no friends, who was beaten up and robbed and left for dead. And not even the religious, the priest, the Levite, would even move in his direction, because they weren't allowed to do that by the religious prohibitions of not defiling themselves with blood prior to their entering the temple. But what happened is, Jesus got the person who said, I've been studying the law all my life, and I practiced it all my life. And Jesus says, well, which person was neighbor to the other? And he says, well, the ones who broke the law, the one who had compassion on him. And what was an amazing change, because he should have said, well, you can't blame the first two people. They were priests. They couldn't possibly go and help this person. Besides, it's a dangerous place. Look what happened to somebody there. Oh, no. They had to take care of themselves first. And so Jesus tells this extended story about a man who binds up his wounds, puts the guy on his own beast, takes him to an inn, cares for him, gives money, silver, quite a good quantity, and then says, on my way back, If you spend any more in taking care of him, I will repay you. And Jesus says, so who was the one, who acted as neighbor to the other? This is the one with compassion. And so, there's plenty of rules and laws that we have that sort of guide how we get through life. Sirach is one in the Old Testament. It also, by the way, it had another quotation which I loved, and it said, a faithful friend is a sturdy shelter. He who finds one finds a treasure. A faithful friend is beyond price. No sum can balance his worth or her worth. A faithful friend is a life-saving remedy, such as he who fears God finds. Now that fears God thing is important. Such as he who fears God finds. For he who fears God will behave appropriately, and his friend will be like himself. So Jesus calls us, to move beyond the limits that perhaps our religious practice sets, perhaps our own upbringing sets, perhaps our own self-orientation in the world sets, and to be willing to go beyond. And so that's why he says to the people holding the banquet, in a sense, how come you're doing this? And they're sort of like, wait a minute, this is a nice party. We invited you. What are you complaining about? And then he says, well, there's another dimension here. And it goes beyond honoring yourself or feeding yourself. It has to do with honoring each soul that is enfleshed and walks this world with you. Accepting that, understanding that. And then even though you will surely be putting yourself out, the reality is by putting other people first, you're doing what God wants. And then he certainly will say to you, friend, why sitst thou there in that lowest position? Come here to the banquet. And of course, that's in the kingdom of heaven. Tell you a quick story about a rule breaker. I hope it'll be a quick story. The fact that you're laughing means some of you do not fully believe. I just was there for the death of a teacher, a wonderful teacher. And she always said that she worked in the city schools and in some of the poorest sections of the city. And so you had students coming, and many of them were in dire straits at the beginning. And what she always said to herself, and other people knew this, in fact, as she was dying, there were hundreds of people that were coming. About 100 people came just to the hospital to visit because they heard that she was sick. And so one of the stories is, as another teacher who was there with her told me, she said, and as one of the family members said, the principal came by and he actually said, at one point, I would have fired you five times over because you broke the rules, but you were the best teacher this school ever had. And here's one of the rules that she broke. Teaching 8th grade. Now, please understand I'm not encouraging people to be in this situation, okay? Sometimes it's amazing what you can say at the pulpit and other people take it in just a certain most narrow way. You're encouraging this. I'm talking about compassion. And what happened is in the 8th grade, one of the girls got pregnant. Now, the girl wanted to keep the baby, although she wasn't happy about becoming pregnant. But she felt the holiness of it, the sacredness of it, the importance of it, the obligation of it, responsibility of it. And what would normally happen, though, if you were in the 8th grade and you got pregnant, what happens? You're out. You're out. Oh, because if you had stayed, you'd be a bad example. You'd be giving scandal to the other people here. You would be encouraging. I had it happen in a high school, a religious high school, where the girl, was getting close to graduate, but also close to delivery. And unfortunately, the sister said, I'm sorry, you can't graduate. I never thought that was a good decision. I think it couldn't have been anything helpful. And I thought that it seemed rather old-fashioned, that the people that really would be scandalized today, or back then even, and that was 42 years ago, wouldn't have been scandalized by the fact that someone got pregnant, but he's scandalized by the fact that a religious institution had no mercy or no compassion. And so what happened is this teacher at this Baltimore City grammar school in the 8th grade The children came forward and said, we'd like to have a shower for her because she really doesn't have any kind of family that would do this. Can we do it? And the teacher said, instead of saying, I'm sorry, that's not allowed, she said yes. And so they had a little shower, so at least this girl had a little bit of something to start out. But she also had the opportunity for her friends to gather. A faithful friend is a sturdy shelter. He who finds one finds a treasure. A faithful friend is beyond price. No sum can balance his or her worth. A faithful friend is a life-saving remedy such as he who fears God finds, because he or she who fears God behaves accordingly, and his friend will be like himself. So these readings today ask us, the invitatory prayer, the opening prayer was, help us reverence your name. And so if we do hold holy God's name, if we do revere God, then what obligations does that place upon us? It has to be more than just taking care of our own business. It has to be striving to be holy as God is holy, to be as self-giving as Jesus is self-giving, to be as compassionate as the Good Samaritan, and to be willing to say, like we hear once a year on Ash Wednesday, we're all going to die. You know, the person with the most toys when they die is not the one who wins. You know, it's the person that has been a loving, human, caring, self-sacrificing, and in order to be that, you have to be humble. You have to begin to say, you know what, we're not the greatest thing in the world. There are other people more deserving and more in need, and perhaps in need of more love. And if we consider ourselves to be the disciples of a loving God, then we really have no choice but to go where they are and to share what we have. There was a little sign in the Evergreen house. I think it's the second floor near an elevator. And it said this. It has to do with reflecting on something. And especially in a way it sort of fits like, here's something I always thought I was entitled to. And it said, I grew up my whole life thinking that air was free. I grew up my whole life thinking that air was free until I bought a bag of chips.